Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the scariest or most frightening real life story you've ever heard? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was about 7, my two brothers and I were playing in an area that was used as an unofficial motocross place. We decided to take a tunnel for some reason. Being the extra smart guys we were, it took a few hours to dig about 6 feet in and 2 feet high. I was right up in the face when suddenly the tunnel collapsed. It was all dirt with no supports. My world went instantly black and hot. By hot, I mean furnace hot. I couldn't move a muscle from the weight of the soil completely enclosing me. I started to really panic, as you do. Everything started turning red, which I guess was blood being forced into my head. Every breath was getting harder as the soil constrained me more and more. Even though my hands were near my face, I couldn't move my arms to clear the dirt around my head, and also started breathing in dirt, which made me cough, which made me contract my stomach, and then I couldn't draw breath at all. This isn't what made me panic though. The total darkness turning red with the incredible heat made my young mind think I was going to hell. I don't know how long I was buried for, but it seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, I felt something grab one of my feet. My brothers had been frantically digging through the collapse to pull me out and managed to reach me and then pull me out. We never told my parents. I just went home and got hosed down. DL, DR. I got buried alive and pissed myself. When we first moved into the house I grew up in, I used to hear things calling my name from the opposite end of the house. I would be in my room playing with Legos or something, and I would hear my dad call my name from his room. So I'd go to my parents' bedroom and ask them what they wanted, and they'd always tell me that they never called my name. Being a little kid, I honestly started to think that they were playing a joke on me, because this happened about once every couple of days. Well, one night it happened, and I went to ask them what they wanted like always, but right as I stepped into their room, I heard my mom's voice calling for me from the living room, which is all the way on the other side of the house. It was at that exact point that I knew no one was tricking me, because I was looking at both of my parents sitting in front of me. I kind of kept this to myself until my brother was diagnosed with partial narcolepsy. One of the symptoms of narcolepsy is apparently oral hallucinations, so I thought maybe I had it, and when I got myself checked, I was completely fine. So I have no idea what was calling my name all those years, and I still hear it at night whenever I come visit and stay over. Okay, this is 100% true. I'm 23 now, and this happened about 10 years ago, so I was probably 13 or 14. Anyway, I used to skateboard all the time with my friends Tim and Brandon. One day, we got done skating and decided to go to 7-Eleven to get some food and drinks before we went home. Remember, I was only 13 or 14, so we weren't driving. We had skated to the 7-Eleven and were planning on skating or walking back home. Anyway, we bought our drinks and we left the store. We walked to the parking lot's exit and prepared to cross the highway. It's not a busy highway since it's a small town. While we waited for the traffic light to turn red so that we could cross, I looked behind me at the 7-Eleven gas pumps. I noticed a 40 to 50-year-old man pumping gas into his white truck. He stared at me, and before I knew it, he dropped the gas pump and jumped into his truck. He slammed on the gas and sped straight at me and my friends. He missed us, but he grazed my arm and knocked my skateboard out of my hand. My friend Brandon screamed, "What the, you dick?" as the man peeled out and sped into the parking lot next to 7-Eleven. I swear to God he drove through a ditch, which was between 7-Eleven's parking lot and the parking lot he was in, and tried to run us over again. This is where it got bad. The three of us started running at full speed across the highway and toward the local library, which is like 2 to 3 blocks from 7-Eleven. When we were about half a block away, I looked back and saw the maniac speeding toward us, full of rage. Brandon and Tim ran up to the library doors, and I ran toward the woods. It was Sunday, so I knew the library was closed, and there was a trail in the woods that led to my backyard. Meanwhile, this maniac peeled into the parking lot and hopped out of his truck. I looked behind me before escaping into the woods and saw him grab either a shotgun or a crowbar. I was pretty far away at that point, and I was freaking out, so my vision wasn't great from the bed of his truck. I ran all the way home. When I got to my street, my neighbor, Tim's dad, told me to get in his car because we had to go to the video store, which is where Tim's mom worked. When I got there, I found Tim and Brandon. They ran to the video store after realizing that the library was closed, and 3 cops. A minute later, my mom came in crying her eyes out because Brandon and Tim told her they didn't know if I lived or not. Everyone thought that I was captured. Tim told me he saw the guy running after me into the woods, which is funny because I thought the maniac was chasing them, not me. Anyway, he was never caught, and I spent the next 5 years worrying about every white truck I saw. Woke up. The clock says 3:34 a.m. I'm 17 and in my bedroom. It's pitch black, but I hear some rattling downstairs. Terrified, I quietly tiptoed to my parents' room. Weird, it's empty. Where are my parents at 3:34 a.m.? Go upstairs to my brother's room. He's usually awake all night, but while the light is on, no one is in the room. So I guess whatever those noises are downstairs, it must be them. Why are they awake? Maybe someone died. I go downstairs. In the middle of my living room is what looks like 2 men stealing our TV. No one else is in sight. I run upstairs as quietly as possible, shut and lock my door. Suddenly there's banging on the door. I wake up. It was a dream, and the relief washes over me. I look over at the clock. Weird coincidence. It's 3:34 a.m. I'm shaking, but I decide to go downstairs to prove to myself that everything's fine. I go downstairs. The 2 men are in my kitchen, screaming at my parents and brother. I ran upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door. 10 seconds later, I hear banging. I woke up. It's 3:34 a.m. This time I had actually woken up, and I didn't manage to fall back asleep for about 36 hours. That was some Inception stuff right there. Keep waking up, it's like a dream and a dream and a dream. I think you're okay, right? I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like an attached house, except freestanding with 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. It was full of quirks, such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the center of the basement, a backyard so small that you could not take 5 paces without hitting the fence, and an old-timey rope pulled-down dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I love that weird little place, but unfortunately it was incredibly old, and half of its charm was the fact that it seemed to have been designed by an inarticulate conclave of lunatics. Eventually, the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, and we had to move. Preparing for the move was a chore. I packed most of my stuff myself, and I had taken to throwing stuff down the dumbwaiter and shoving all my clothes so thickly in my closet that they became a single solid brick of fabric. While clearing the closet out, in fact, I came across a feature I hadn't noticed before, an attic entrance in the roof. Being an adventurous kid, I opened her up, stood on the clothes brick, and began my first and last exploration into the topmost part of our weird little house. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with old red Christmas lights that still burned with leftover incandescence, and a dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into all the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the place was set up for habitation. The insulation was plasticed away. There was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and there was a rusted mint green refrigerator that still worked when I tested it. The thing was the bones. There were lots of bones. I was a kid at the time, with a limited understanding of anatomy, but there were bones of all types heaped into a series of piles around the center of the attic, small and large, clean and white, from every and any imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked in half a dozen osseous clumps. Two of them were blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them, and the walls nearest those blackened piles were scrawled in dark bone charm messages. Most of them were just smears, but the word sorry appeared more than once. That room had been sitting over my head for 8 years while I slept. So my uncle used to work a lot when I was younger. He's done a lot of different things to make money, but one consistent thing is that in the summer months and until late fall he paints houses. It's a legitimate business and everything. He's got a truck with a number and name and supplies in the back, the works. Every now and then he would call my dad when he needed a little extra help, and I'd work for him. No big deal really, it's just painting houses. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it takes a while to paint a whole house. If the weather conditions aren't right, then you can't paint. One particular fall was extremely wet. It rained what felt like every single day. My uncle would paint multiple houses at a time, so sometimes he would get caught up due to situations like these, and I'd work a little more than usual. That was fine with me though. The job wasn't hard and it paid well. Anyway, it was a warm day for late fall, but there was still a distinct chill in the air. One that kind of penetrated through you and stung your soul. My uncle had this job he had to finish. It was an old Victorian house in a quiet part of town. A lady and her husband, who was an author, lived there. Due to the weather, it had taken longer than expected to paint the house, and there were family issues going on at the time, which further complicated things. So my uncle gets a call one day from the lady who lives at the house. She says that her husband is trying to write his next book, but he keeps getting distracted by the scaffolding outside the house. So she wants to know if we could come over and finish the job as soon as possible. My uncle was always an honest businessman. They had contracted him to do the job in midsummer, but he had lots of jobs that summer, and the wet conditions I mentioned above made it difficult to finish anything. However, these people were insistent but really polite, and not wanting to lose customers or get a bad recommendation, my uncle decided to make the house a high priority. After all, it would only take a day or two to finish. So we show up at this house mid-afternoon, like I said. It was a weird kind of chilly that day, and I also remember a really eerie calm. The day was slightly overcast, so everything was shrouded in gray. It was like the perfect setting for a mystery crime novel. So we arrive at this house, and my uncle and I move to the back. The front of the house was already done, so there was nothing left there. My uncle, being the more experienced painter, would always do the touch-ups, and I would simply apply the first coats since they took little skill. Anyway, we get to the back of the house, and he asks me if I'm scared of heights. I was 17 at the time, and although they do creep me out a little, I didn't want to seem like a child in front of my uncle, so I told him that I wasn't. He was happy to hear that. He has me climb up the scaffold to the 3rd floor to finish an upper section of the house. There was a window up there, small, oval, and one that looked into the attic. The attic also happened to be the husband's study. He would do most of his writing in there. So I'm climbing up this scaffolding with cans of paint dangling behind me and various paintbrushes and other tools in my utility belt my uncle let me borrow. I get to the top of the scaffolding and set all my supplies down. I crack open a can of paint and start painting like I had a few hundred times before. Outside of the temperature, the overcast, and the eerie calm, this day was like any other. I'm working my way across the top part of the house when I get to the window that looks into the study. I bend down, dip my paintbrush, and stand back up to paint the above window. The window was in my direct line of sight, and I couldn't help gazing in. I see a man, the husband, staring back at me with a face completely barren of emotion. I had never seen a face so devoid of feeling before. I still haven't. Of course, I get startled and take a step back. I chuckle and smile at the guy, but he doesn't smile back. Instead, while remaining completely emotionless, he draws a pistol up to his head that he was holding in his hand the whole time and proceeds to blow his brains out without breaking eye contact. right in front of me while I'm staring at him. In utter shock, I gasped and let out the smallest scream as I stepped back in fear. I only stepped back a step too much and fell off the scaffolding. Alerted by the gunshot, my uncle looked up in just enough time to see me fall off the scaffolding from the 3rd story. I was lucky enough to land in a bush and only suffer a broken ankle and a few scratches. The biggest wound happened in my face. I've never forgotten it. I had to go to counseling for a while. It's been years since then, and I still remember that man's face. I've never forgotten it. It will always be burned into the back of my head. I know why, looking back, his face was so devoid of emotion. Because he never felt any emotion at all. He literally didn't care about his wife. Combined with a few too many nights drunk on whiskey and facing writer's block, I guess. He decided he couldn't take it anymore. His wife moved out of the house shortly after, and we never finished the job. To this day, that house remains abandoned, and to this day, I try not to drive down that part of the street it's on. I'm scared that if I do and happens to the backyard, I'll see that man staring back at me from that window, cold and emotionless. I always seem to get to these threads when my story will surely be buried, but here goes. When I was 13, my grandmother was dying of cancer, and my mother and I stayed at her house and took care of her during the last few weeks. One night at 3 or so in the morning, my mother ran into my room and told me that my grandmother, who was by this time completely bedridden, entered my mother's room, woke her up, and then walked out of the room. There was no creepiness at the time, just a genuine concern for what my grandmother could possibly be doing up at 3 a.m., when she was literally days away from dying. We ran into her room, and sure enough, she had passed away. Obviously, given the shock of my grandmother dying, my mother and I didn't sit around chatting about how weird the whole experience was, but months of perhaps even years later, I ask her about that night, and she has no memory of telling me that my grandmother was up and walking around the house. She doesn't even remember what woke her up or why she woke me up. It gives me shivers just writing it. When I was 8, my family moved from urban South Florida to a really small town in North Florida. It was like a Goosebumps book. A lot of weird stuff has happened in the 15 years since we moved there, but the weirdest has got to be when my sister moved back in with my parents. My sister's husband had been shipped off to Afghanistan, so she was left alone with the newborn son. Not wanting to go through the soul-crushing loneliness of raising a newborn all alone in a trailer in the woods, she moved back into my parents' house for a while. She said it started first when the headboard of her bed would slam every now and then. Then one day she woke up because somebody was tickling her. She didn't realize or really think about it until one night she woke my mom up by screaming. My sister is almost 30. She's not a little kid. And my mom went in, and the whole effing bed was rocking and shaking like really violently up there to the sides, like a boat going through white water. But my mom and sister had been through a lot of shit, so they preserved. One night, my sister was nursing her son when something grabbed her ponytail and started yanking her head around. My mom went into the room and very sternly, like talking to a bad kid, said, "I understand things are different. There's a little baby here, and there never has been before. You're curious. I understand that, but you will not touch them anymore. You can look. You can stay. You were here before us, but I swear to God, you are not allowed to touch them." It stopped happening. When I was a child, I lived in an old Victorian house, and I would always hear laughing while I was trying to sleep. I was an only child with a single mother, and when I was about 5 or 6, I would wake hearing laughter in the hallway in the middle of the night. After mentioning this to my mom, she swore it was probably just the TV being left on late. One night, I awoke hearing laughter in my room. I went to sit up, but it felt like there was something holding my shoulders down, invisible hands gripping into my shoulders while they heard laughter. I screamed my little heart out. My mom ran into my room, flicking on the bedside lamp, convincing me it was just a dream until I said, "But my shoulder hurts." She lifted up my t-shirt, and there were 2 adult-sized handprints on my shoulder. I honestly thought I had imagined it, and that it had never happened. But the other day, I mentioned it in passing to my mom, and she went blanket white and said, "I don't want to remember that."